what you wear, when you eat, when you sleep. And that control is continued once you enter the system. If you are pregnant or parenting, in a lot of states, they still shackle girls, right? They shackle them even though there is ample data and research and evidence and best practices that have been put out that say that shackling at any point during pregnancy can cause harm to both the mother and the baby, right? DC has a pending juvenile justice bill right now. Last year they amended it to say that girls in their third and maybe second trimester can't be shackled. This bill, the newest version, would say any child really shouldn't be shackled unnecessarily, right? That the use of shackles is a human rights violation, right? And that it's unnecessary in most cases. But oftentimes a girl is not going to know or even report that she's pregnant, right? So if I was just raped right before I came into intake and the person who raped me did not use protection, I may be pregnant and not know it, right? And so they could be inadvertently causing harm to me, putting my baby at risk potentially, and not giving me all of the information and access to information that I need to make an informed decision about what I'm going to do in that situation, right? So there are solutions, I promise. One of them is really to pay attention, to ask questions, to look at knowing what we know about child abuse, about sexual abuse. How can we tailor our systems to, one, ensure that children that don't need to be there are not there, right? The contention among most of the organizations that are in this room actually is that there are a ton of kids in our juvenile system that should not be there, and that for those kids that do need to be there or will find themselves there for more seriously violent offenses, we should ensure that our system is appropriately responsive to them, right? That gives them an opportunity to get the services that they need. And so this is just sort of National Child Traumatic Stress Network put out some guidelines on what it looks like for a system to be trauma-informed. Everybody's throwing around this, we need a trauma-informed juvenile justice system. There isn't clarity on what exactly that looks like, but the idea is that whatever that system looks like, it takes into these factors into account. So, sorry, I don't know what happened. Well, we can stop there with the, basically there are, let's see, what happened? Okay. Well, basically, I'll really quickly talk about the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act and the provisions that are in there, and one other campaign that our organization has, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, the JJDPA, is the only piece of federal legislation that really regulates or create some standards for state juvenile justice systems, right? And it basically says if you don't do these things, then you can't get federal funding, or your ability to get federal funding will be impacted. It also says that we encourage you to do these other things, right? So there are a bunch of very important provisions in the newest version of the bill, which passed out of the Senate committee last summer, and which many organizations here are doing a lot of advocacy to push through. The important provisions for girls are, one, it requires screening, particularly for trafficking, but also for trauma, right? And the idea is if you are screened for being trafficked, that you are theoretically diverted away from the system and into community-based programs and or the child welfare system that can more appropriately serve you, right? And then it also requires screening because there are kids that are going to come in on other charges, like a robbery, like a grand theft auto, like a fight, right? For which they should also be screened, because when you're developing the treatment plan or response, it should take that into account, right? It also ends the shackling of pregnant girls. So there is a very important amendment in there that led by Senators Cornyn and Schumer that basically says that girls should not be shackled while pregnant at any point in pregnancy or postpartum, actually, because we know that it can still cause harm. There is also really important language in there that provides funding for prevention programming. There is also very important language in there that basically provides support for gender-specific or gender-responsive programs. And then there are some pieces around data collection, particularly of pregnant girls. We currently have no national data count on how many pregnant girls are in custody. So when I talk about the lack of data, I know it sounds like wonky. If we don't count it, then we haven't even decided that it matters, right? So the lack of data is actually an indication of how we are prioritizing girls in our system, right? Separately from that, our organization started a campaign last year called the No Such Thing campaign. The idea is that there's no such thing as a child prostitute, and that we must eliminate the arrest and detention of children, both in language and in law. So we have a big campaign with the media to eliminate the term child prostitute. We had a big win in April when the Associated Press, who we had petitioned, eliminated the term. They put out their style guide and said we will no longer use the term child prostitute because it doesn't make legal sense, right? It's not accurate reporting. We're now imploring other outlets to do the same. I don't know if you guys have been following this big crisis with the police department in Oakland, but a lot of the reporting around that has been problematic, and it's come out that that girl was first exploited when she was 12. By the police department, the first time was when she was 16. And so the references to her as a teen prostitute, as a young prostitute, are all incredibly harmful, not only to her, but to the movement and to other girls in that situation, because it perpetuates this misunderstanding of who these kids are. So if you have questions or want to know more about that campaign is featured on our Rights for Girls website. But with that, I would just end by saying that for you starting in this work, whenever you enter a conversation about juvenile justice, always ask yourself or be the one in the room to say, and what about the girls? Or what about the gender nonconforming youth? What about the LGBTQ youth? Because I will say that I said we include gender nonconforming girls. These stereotypes about what is feminine, what is ladylike, how a girl is supposed to act that impact our court's decisions to bring girls into the system, if you can imagine that for a cisgendered girl, that's true, then you can imagine that that is exacerbated for gender nonconforming youth, right? That our attitudes towards these children impact their system involvement and how deep they go into the system and what kind of support they get. So I think one of the things that was the problem before is that we weren't asking these questions, right? So the more that you ask these questions, the more that you think about the gender lens, especially as like up-and-coming advocates in this work, the more progress we can make on behalf of our girls. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Yeah.
Could you speak more about working as a service provider and deciding to go to law school? How do you envision your law degree being relevant to your day-to-day work for Rights for Girls? I think a lot of us here are interested in law school or graduate school, but not seeing exactly how it informs work at nonprofits and advocacy. So I will say, I had not intended to go to law school. I thought I wanted to get like a MSW PhD and do like participatory action research with young women, which maybe I will hopefully still do one day. But it was really that I got frustrated because I felt like a lot of the defenders that were interacting with my girls didn't know how to have the conversations with them to provide them with a zealous defense. So that girl, for example, that I told you about, it was problematic to me that a community-based service provider was the first person to get that information from her 5 years after her system involvement, right? That our defenders, as incredible as trial attorneys as they were, didn't have the capacity to be able to know how to develop that relationship of trust. And I know that there are great defender organizations. The National Juvenile Defender Center does a ton of training, right? Because juvenile defense is different, right? And so I went to law school because I thought I wanted to be a juvenile defender and did the clinic. I came to Georgetown because of their juvenile justice clinic, and because I had been exposed to it through my work with the campaign in college, actually. But I realized that, in a lot of defenders' offices, they immediately want you to go. The good offices, in a lot of ways, won't put you with juveniles first, right? Because they believe that it's a different kind of defense and that you need to learn basic trial skills, which is good and important. Some offices will, but their emphasis is really on building those skills, right? And for me, at that point, I felt like I needed to do more systemic level change.
So that was why I ended up going a policy route, with the hope of still being able to do some defense on the side. That's not something that I've like ruled out. In terms of the decision to go to law school, it was really to be able to practice, right? It was that I wanted to, as a service provider, when you come from service provision world, there is a tendency to feel like no one knows it like you do, right? And that there are all these policy folks that do all this work and don't feel and touch and breathe and see the kids, right? I have been very humbled because I have been exposed to organizations and agencies, like a lot of the ones that you work for, that root all of their work in elevating the voices of those most directly impacted, being a conduit for information. So having a law degree in my policy work has, one, enabled me to do it at a level where if we want to submit an amicus brief in a case, I can do that, right? Because I'm a barred attorney. I wouldn't be able to do that otherwise. There is also, people listen to you differently, quite frankly. I was doing a report in law school on the back end of the school to prison pipeline called Keep Out, where we interviewed like 100 parents and students and system folk in LA County to talk about like why is it so hard for kids to get back in school once they've been suspended, expelled, or referred to the courts. I thought none of those organizations would talk to us, but when we called and said it was like students from Georgetown Law, they were like, yes. So there is a privilege that comes with it. There's a voice that you get. You get into rooms that people wouldn't let you in. I oftentimes say, the stories that I have and the things that I say are not very different from what I was saying as a service provider. I have a little bit more of like a lens in terms of how federal policy works, for example, or how you pass laws. Like, I didn't understand that well, right? And it allows a bridging, right? So if you have the service provider perspective, you can talk to service providers and elicit information, or you can talk to survivors in a way that you know is safe, that is not tokenizing, because in the policy world, oftentimes we'll be like, oh, let's go get that directly impacted person and stick them on a panel or on a briefing. And we won't pay them. We won't think about how traumatizing it might be to testify to a room full of people about all the worst things that have happened to you. Our organizations often get money off of that, and we don't make sure that the community or the person is getting it right. So identifying organizations that value that, right? Like, I was very lucky and did my research, right? Because I had that lens as a service provider of like, how do they work with survivors? How do they treat survivors? How do they engage in their advocacy? Are they connected to the family and state and student-led groups that are doing this work, right? Where is their information coming from? All of those things have helped, but the decision to go to law school was one to be able to get language. There's a quote by the poet Adrienne Rich that says, she says something like, you speak the oppressor's language, but I need it to speak to you. And I would say that that's a huge reason why I went to law school. It sounds crazy, but and it's being recorded, but I felt like in a lot of ways, the tools, the language of law school gave me the ability to kind of like fight fire with fire, and you can't amend laws if you don't understand the law, right? That being said, I will say to all of you, think very carefully about, not everyone needs to go to law school. You don't need to go to law school to be a great advocate. You do not need to be a service provider if that's not your calling. And there are a lot of people that go into service provision and it's really not their skill set, and maybe they shouldn't be there. So I would say if you're figuring that out, take the time to figure out and try different, like, you can't know until you try different things. For a long time, my resume looked like it made no sense because I did international stuff and I did women's rights stuff and then I did all this juvenile justice stuff and it was all focused on boys, and people were like, what is this? But for me, I was like, I'm gonna take opportunities that are interesting to me and then craft the narrative out of that, right? So like, your narrative will come once you get experience that you are, and once you develop passion around things or skill sets around things, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but
very much so. Thank you.
Other questions?
Is there a girls' facility like New Beginnings? Because I just did New Beginnings work at AU this past year.
Okay.
Yeah, so we were with the boys, but one of the things we were looking into is doing a girls' mentoring program similar to what we did with the boys, but we couldn't figure out where that service would be provided. Because from what my understanding was, my supervisor only thought that there were girls in group homes, not necessarily like a facility like New Beginnings for the girls. Yeah,
they're talking about opening a girls unit so they can bring some of the girls who have been committed to farther places and or tried in the adult system back home, but that's still being discussed. Girls are housed at YSC,
Okay.
and then they are housed in different